Francois from
nice
the
to meet you.
PIDF Pacific Islands
Fantastic.
Development Forum.
Good to meet you. How are you doing?
Nice meeting you too.
Very good.
Good.
Cool. I'm looking forward to this.
You okay with this? Because we can easily change.
You're sitting at my place, so we can shift it. Then we are identified. Yeah, so I'll be happy to this side. Now I hidden myself.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, if I may ask you to please sit down. Let's prepare for the beginning of this side event. First of all, welcome to this side event that is being jointly held between ICARDA and PIDF. This side event brings together two very diverse regions. The Pacific, represented by PIDF, and the Middle East and North African region, represented by ICARDA. It also brings together areas that are usually not well connected with each other. But one thing we want to demonstrate here is that climate change is actually a problem that is affecting everybody. Whether you live in the Pacific, whether you are in the Arctic, whether you are in Africa, we all suffer the impacts of climate change. Today we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Francois Martel, Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Development Forum. To his left is Mr. Ali Abu Saba, Director General of ICARDA. Next to him is Mr. Eduardo Mansour, Director of Land and Water of the Food and Agriculture Organization. Next to him is His Excellency Anote Tong, the former President of Kiribati and an important climate champion. Next to the President is Louise Baker, Coordinator for External Relations, Policy and Advocacy of the United Nations Convention on Desertification. And finally, but not least, is Genevieve Jiva, the COP23 Project Officer for the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network. So I invite first Mr. Francois Martel, who will deliver a keynote speech, followed afterwards by Director General Ali Abu Saba with another keynote speech to open the session. Mr. Martel.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, there you go. Has a green light. Thank you very much, Mark, for this for the introduction as a moderator. Let me first acknowledge President Anote Tong, Director General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to pass on my appreciation to ICARDA for giving us the opportunity and giving it the opportunity to the Pacific to have a voice here this evening on the importance of limiting temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and the importance of in keeping the momentum towards high ambition and urgency over the 3 years remaining in the lead to the Paris Agreement start of implementation in 2020. Today we are gathered here at a most important time because this year during this COP presidency, this has been entrusted to Fiji, a Pacific Island country and a prominent member of my organization, the Pacific Islands Development Forum. Is also the year when we have the opportunity to pursue high ambition and urgency for small islands and vulnerable developing states at a time where discussions on the rule book could become an excuse for delaying high ambition and implementation by many parties that have ratified the Paris Agreement. Our current trajectory towards 4 degrees Celsius increase since pre-industrial level is far from the letter and spirit of the Paris Agreement. It is also irresponsible towards people and the planet, and its impact for Pacific Islands remain existential in many cases. Today at this side event, we discussed the relevance of temperature targets on 2 important issues: food security, on which human life itself depends and on which many farmers, fishers, and growers are investing their livelihoods, and displacement of people and communities as a result of climate change and reduced opportunity to sustain their livelihoods. I'm sure that Mr. Abu Sabah of ICARDA and Mr. Mansour of FAO will focus a lot on food security, and I will do a little bit of it in their own time. So I will focus on also climate-induced migration, knowing that also His Excellency Anote Tong on the panel is quite an expert on that particular subject. Now, the implication of not limiting temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius are mind-boggling, to say the least. But in the Pacific, we are already experiencing its effects. 1.5 degrees Celsius still poses serious adaptive challenges for SIDS in vulnerable countries, and to keep this target alive remains essential to minimize loss and damage in the future. Scientists are telling us, and recent events and observations at the community level in the Pacific Islands confirm a steep rise in occurrence of hot temperature extremes by at least 15% across the tropics at 1.5 degrees Celsius, significant increase in heat wave duration to about 2 months per year, robust increase in extreme precipitation by 7 to 8%. In fact, observational records of only 0.5 degrees Celsius increase of global warming show significant differences already. 1 degree Celsius increase in hot temperature extremes and 9% increase in extreme precipitation intensity. For islands, decreased survival of tropical reefs, coral reefs, with coral reef degradation up to 70% of degradation at 1.5 degrees Celsius, up to 98% at 2 degrees Celsius. Higher risk of extreme El Nino events increased by 130%. And here we're talking about increase in droughts and increase in category 4 and 5 cyclones at 1 degree Celsius, 0.5 Celsius. Increase in extent and rate of sea level rise by 40 centimeters by the end of the century, although recent projections show a far larger increase of up to 3 meters. And already islands disappearing have been recorded in the Pacific Islands, in particular in the Solomon Islands. Now, for Pacific Islands, this list of climate-related outcomes has major impact on food security. In Melanesia and many parts of Micronesia and Polynesia, more than 75% of food proteins come from coastal fisheries and marine resources. In return, sustainable coastal fisheries depend on healthy lagoons, healthy reefs, mangroves, and oceans, all marine ecosystems currently threatened by climate change and marine pollution at an incredible scale. with evidence of coral reef bleaching across the entire Pacific Ocean. By extension, reduced access to drinking water is accentuated by climate change in the forms of increase in water salinity and droughts. These further will and already have led to internal climate-induced displacement and to potential for extensive migration in cases of island-wide climate disasters, particularly on low-lying Pacific atolls, found in almost all our countries. All these above are exponentially impacted by climate-induced disasters, as we have seen recently following the hurricanes in the Caribbean. In the last few years, we have seen the exodus of people from Africa and the Middle East pouring into Europe, and the chaos that this created. We've seen this from afar in the Pacific. What did not really come out of this entire story, which is not yet over and still unfolding, is the impact that climate change had on the decision that these people made to leave their homes to try and find greener pastures. And this can also almost be taken in the literal sense. Because when people go through droughts year in and year out, or cyclones year in and year out, what prospect are there for their own selves and their families' future? I would here argue that climate-induced migration has been happening now for a while, and it is further recognized in the numbers provided us in millions of climate-related displaced people by the International Organization on Migration. The Pacific is also experiencing its own silent and creeping crisis. Many people on the atolls have moved for their own smaller islands to the larger islands, partly because the changes in the climate are making it so much harder for them to meet their needs for their families' livelihoods. This is happening by people taking their own initiative, and we see mobility within the countries in the Pacific, and in some instances between countries, with the larger countries accepting people from neighboring smaller islands. But now we see this happening also as an exercise by the states, where whole villages are being relocated to higher grounds because their villages are being inundated by sea level rise, or they have been completely destroyed by an increasing severity of cyclones, with Category 5 cyclones now becoming the norm for us. So we see, for example, in Fiji, have relocated already 3 villages in the last couple of years, with some other 60 villages listed and waiting to be relocated based on the government vulnerability assessment. Moving people to new location is not a decision to be taken easily. Pacific people in particular have special attachment to their land, very little land actually, as they are large oceanic states, and as it is ancestral and customary owned. And this can be quite heartbreaking for those communities affected, with strong impacts on culture and traditions. All this at a current temperature rise of barely 1 degree Celsius. In a business as usual scenario, we are expecting an increase in temperature of close to 4 degrees by the end of the century, which scientists are now telling us would translate to a 3-meter level rise. His Excellency's country here, President of Kiribati, is 3 meters at its highest point. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is why we stress the urgency and the need for ambition in these negotiations. This is why we stress the need to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, not because we're going to have a rosy climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we are experiencing at 1 degree Celsius now as anything to go by, but it will at least give us a fighting chance. Anything beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius will leave us no real hope. Let alone talking about sustainable development goals. For islanders, achieving the SDGs by 2030 will ultimately be at the condition that SDG 13 on climate action is successful, so as to not reverse the gain we have made over the last decades in terms of all other SDGs. This is why we are calling for accelerating the phasing out of fossil fuels, the technologies that depend or use them, and advocate for a future towards low-carbon development strategies and a paradigm shift towards sustainable green and blue economies. This, I think, will conclude my keynote address, and I'll pass it on to the Director General of ICARDA. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in this late afternoon event. The Secretary General has painted the situation, the very, very difficult situation of the islands that could trigger large-scale mass migration, in addition, of course, to massive loss of livelihoods as a result of seawater level rise. What I'm going to do is to try and paint a different picture in another part of the world where the conditions and the potential impact of rising temperatures could also cause large-scale loss of livelihoods and possibly large-scale patterns of migration. I think it is fairly known that under the Paris Agreement, there are certain level of commitments for reduced emissions that could help us stay within or below the 1.5 degrees temperature rise. But what if those commitments are not delivered, and what if the models and assumptions that underpin these scenarios do not materialize the way they are predicted? In fact, there is a reasonable level of evidence to support that some level of variation of those commitments or not being able to meet these commitments could easily take the world into a 3-degree warmer scenario. And there was also a recent World Bank report, I think 2014, which predicted a possibility of 20% the world reaching 4 degrees by the end of the century. So the question is, what do you do? Do you wait and find out, or one should be prudent enough to develop the right life support systems, the alternative livelihoods that are needed to support these kind of affected people, if that ever happens? In the region where ICARDA is active, that is the drylands, there is evidence that the year 2010 was the warmest ever since man started to record temperatures. In fact, 19 of the countries in the region where we work have reached global high records of temperature. 5 of the MENA countries have gone into those high levels, including in Kuwait, where we have seen 53.5 degrees recorded in 2010, and prior to that, in 2011, and prior to that, 52.4. So we are already seeing evidence of some of the countries in the region moving in that direction. So why discuss a potentially a warming region up to 4 degrees level? That is because there is a 40% chance of actually reaching or exceeding this 4-degree warming levels in this region. There is about 10% chance of exceeding the 5-degree even in the region. And the sources are quite reliable, World Bank as well as the IEA report of 2012. Now, what would it mean for the region in the drylands? What would happen under a 4-degree world or a 4-degree warmer region? This could affect about 70 to 80% of the people living in the land area of the MENA region in particular. This will mean rainfall could reduce by up to 60%. Some areas would go out of production completely. And the population, this would happen at a time where the population is projected to increase to almost double by the year 2050. Crop yields would drastically go down, in fact, by as much as 60% in countries like Syria, a country that is already going through serious conflict. Legume and maize will be most affected crops. And of course, that calls for new ways to build the resilience of the communities living in these areas and new ways to adapt to these conditions. This slide shows you the Siwana region in general and the parts of the region that is going to be affected the most, with the parts highlighted in red to be most affected in the sense of higher temperatures, but also in terms of reduction in rain. What we have been doing in ICARDA is working with our partners within the CGIAR system and national research partners both within the region and outside the region to work on developing the new crop systems that could provide the climate resilient crops that will be needed under those extreme scenarios. Our research programs are focused on crop improvements for yield potential, but also for abiotic and biotic stresses. We're looking at integration. We are trying to bring in the crop and the livestock together with water to support much more integrated systems to increase the resilience of the communities in those areas. We're looking at options for intensification and diversification of cropping systems. We're looking at the potential for large-scale adoption of protected agriculture under extreme conditions, improvements in the water availability and management of gray and possibly recycled water, and adding value to dairy products, especially in the marginal areas. Now, to support the livelihoods in those areas, ICARDA has been busy developing new technologies that will contribute to increasing the resilience and the capacity of the people living in those areas. We've been testing under the Dryland Research Program about 65 sustainable land management practices and technologies. These have been tested for almost 500,000 people. These include raised bed systems that are aimed to increase yields, but also increase water efficiencies and save water, improved rangeland and animal management, conservation agriculture, large-scale promotion of conservation agriculture, promotion of rain harvesting and landscape modifications, as well as creating the enable environment and capacity development through training. I spoke about the integration, and this is key, and that evolves from the on-farm feed production through some of the climate-resistant crops, such as barley, which could also be an excellent input into animal feed, as well as human consumption. The introduction of new varieties of cactus that requires very little water, but could also prove to be a very important component into animal feed, as well as the natural pasture that could arise from barley straw. I mentioned a while ago the raised bed technology. This is technology that has potential to provide 31% increase in grain yields while saving 24% in the irrigation water. A country like Egypt, which is already suffering from extreme water stress, and you could reach 73% increase in the water use efficiency through large-scale adoption of this technology. And under scarce water conditions, there are always trade-offs when it comes to policy making and decision making about what would be the best use of the available water to maximize the use and the production of water, crop per drop, as they say, because in the future, water will be the limiting factor, not land. Rehabilitation of rangelands is key. That's part of the land neutrality agenda of the Convention to Combat Desertification, and also through an adaptation technique that we promote in the rangeland areas. We've developed a technology based on the Valorani scheme, which is basically a mechanized way to introduce water harvesting at large scale. And that is through the use of adaptive equipment that is laser guided. We have worked in certain countries in the Gulf area about the large scale adoption of surface and drip irrigation that would save up to 27% of the water that is used currently through the open surface system, large-scale adoption of liquid pollination, not a new technology, but it's the large-scale adoption that is bringing the increased impact, and the use of the polycarbonate drying beds to reduce the waste coming out of the date production. Technology around the use of the hydroponics, the protected agriculture, and improved seeds and land management practices. One of the greatest advantages that we have in ICARDA is that we have a very important collection from the genetic resources. The non-tropical drylands has 4 key very special and very unique agro-biodiversity centers through which we've managed to collect almost 155,000 different accessions from the key commodities or from the key crops where ICARDA has the global mandate. Barley, wheat, chickpea, fava bean, lentil. I think we rank between the first, second, and third globally. And we try to use this genetic resource to introduce the new crop varieties, because the region where we live in has gone through these things, through these extreme climate conditions in the past history, and we try to isolate those new traits and use it in the crop improvement programs to be able to develop the crops that would be able to survive in the future under those extreme conditions. One example that we always like to cite is the collaboration with our sister institution, CIMMYT, under what we call the One Global Wheat program. And that allows us to test some of the new varieties in several locations that are shown in the map globally. And we're able to continue to adjust and evaluate these new varieties that continue to be produced. Large-scale adoption of these improved varieties, we've targeted 12 African countries, 2 main types, the heat-prone in the lowlands and the disease-prone in the highlands, 3 hubs through 9 partner countries. The impact is that we've managed to produce 50 new varieties were released with the national research partners, an increase of between 4 to 7 hectares of yield as opposed to 2 to 3 hectares of an average, up to 400,000 hectares increase in wheat surface in countries where traditionally they have not been producing wheat in the past. And this is a very important contribution to the food security of these countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia and Sudan. We've also been working to produce a short duration lentil for rice fallow in South Asia. About 15 million hectares of land are left fallow each year, and we're trying to use that small window of opportunity to bring in crops such as lentils to first help reduce the food security gap, but also improve the food intake and the nutritional mixture of food available to population in South Asia. We also believe barley has a tremendous potential in the future as a crop that has very, very unique capacity to deal with climate variation. And we continue to improve barley, but we also want to make sure that in the future, the human consumption is also tailored and adjusted so that there is a huge market for barley, and which could potentially and increasingly displace part of the wheat consumption globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, SG Martel and DG Abu Saba, for setting the scene for this side event. Now, the way we're going to approach the next session is to ask a question to each of the panelists. And I ask them to limit their response to less than 7 minutes so that we can have time for questions from the audience as well. And to bring in a female voice to this side event, I will first ask the question to Louise Baker. Louise, UNCCD works in areas going from marginal lands to desert. Dry areas are of major focus to UNCCD. What is your organization doing in the dry areas regarding the changing climate, and has it been effective?
Okay. First question, UNCCD. I'm hoping everybody, thank you, good question. My 7 minutes though. I'm hoping everybody's actually heard of us to start with, right? At least show everybody's good. Okay, so we were one of the sister conventions to climate change, and desertification is just land degradation that happens where it's dry, right? So in the simplest terms. Globally, they're going hand in hand. Land degradation rates are pretty high. We're losing about 12 million hectares of productive land every year. That's both driving climate change and is affected by it. So we are taking the experience from the drylands and trying to roll that out globally, because it is a drylands experience. So when land degradation happens in the drylands, it's really very, very serious. It's kind of the end of the land degradation spectrum, and things run out very, very quickly. Resources run out very, very quickly. What I think we have learned, though, is that the same techniques, the same type of scientific approach, the same type of practical action that happens on the ground can be applied everywhere. What we are doing is we are working on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our target is target 15.3 in the Sustainable Development Goals, the land degradation neutrality idea that was mentioned earlier. That's about conserving the land resources you've got, moving to sustainable management of the land resources under use. This will help with reducing the emissions, because as you know, the land sector is responsible for about 25% of emissions, so that'll bring that down if you sustainably manage it. And focusing a lot on the rehabilitation of land. So if you take what is degraded and put the carbon back in the land and the soil where it's supposed to be, you are making the land more healthy and more productive, which is good for agricultural production. You are sequestering carbon in the soil, getting it out of the atmosphere, second largest carbon sink. So there's a lot that can be done by achieving this LDN target. So we're now moving to a stage where 114 countries are actively setting their targets, and we hope that that will become part of their agricultural policy, their climate policies, and working together. We need to, I think, move into scaling up the good practice that we have seen, and there are amazing examples from the drylands, but in other regions as well, that can be taken to scale. To do that, we are working with our colleagues at Climate Change and Biodiversity on developing a project preparation facility to try to develop transformative, bankable projects that can go to scale. We're also working quite a bit on the issue of migration as well. So recognizing that with a growing population, with growing population densities, and that applies both in the small island states and in the drylands that are seeing really quite high population densities now, reducing the productivity of an area of land and reducing the amount of land that's available is a driver for many social problems. But largely, if the productivity falls, then incomes fall, and there is a push factor associated with that. So looking at this rehabilitation agenda to deliver for climate, to deliver for biodiversity, but also to deliver for economic development and for stabilizing vulnerable areas in climate terms, but also in terms of economic work. So I'm not sure if that responds to the question, but to say we are working very hard on making the land making the work on the land climate smart. We're working very hard on making the lessons that we've learned from one region applicable in other regions. And we know that the discussions that are going on here in terms of climate as a climate sink, as an adaptation, and in terms of adaptation, if you ignore the land agenda, you're missing a trick. and, you know, for climate resilience in the dry lands, for climate resilience in the small island states in the Pacific, but elsewhere, you have to have this land agenda front and center of everything that you're doing on climate. So there's a lot more to do. Have we been successful? Yeah. Is there more to do? Absolutely. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have I got to? No, it's all right. I'll leave more time for questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Now, President Tong, I pass to you. And you bring us back to the Pacific Islands. So your people are already suffering from climate change and could become among the first climate refugees in the world. You have advocated around the world for many years. Do you think the world community understands the plight of your people?
Thank you, and let me try to answer the question. I don't want to repeat what the Secretary General has said because I think it explains pretty much the situation we're in. But I will answer your question in the process, okay? In politics, you never answer a question, okay? Okay, but the first point that I want to make is 1.5 degrees has become somewhat of a magical number. The point I want to make here is that it doesn't help us in any way. And so the mistake that we are making here and everywhere that we've been talking about this is to think that if we limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5, everything is well and good. I can tell you it's not. Because based on the projections of the IPCC, countries like ours and many other low-lying island countries will be underwater, regardless of whether we achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade or 0 degrees centigrade. The momentum of what's already in the atmosphere will ensure that. And so our situation is very, very difficult. We tend to be left behind because we are addressing the point from here on, but we're behind. You need to look back to see what's happening, and nobody's looking back. And now to answer your question, are all of these events dealing with our issues? The answer is no, because of that very, very point. Because ours is not about trying to keep the temperatures down. Ours is about knowing that what is coming will come. And it's about finding solutions to deal with what is coming. And so that is the question that I think I would like to focus on, okay? And the question is, how do we survive in the face of the rising seas and in the face of the increasing severity of the storms, okay? It's not an easy answer. And let me share with you the thoughts that have come through my mind in my moments of desperation, trying to find solutions. I came up with floating islands, okay? I came up with trying to raise the islands above the rising seas. But the point that's important to make is, where are we going to source the resources needed in order to be able to do this, okay? And for countries like Tuvalu, for countries like Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tokelau, the Maldives, and in addition to yesterday we were talking here with my colleagues from Bangladesh. And so we're not talking about numbers here, we're talking about people. And so for those of us on the front line, we are looking for solutions. And so far, we've not been able to come up with solutions. And I would like to suggest that I leave some points for consideration here so that we come away, if not with solutions, we come away better focused on what it is that we need to be dealing with. And so, if the water is rising, what do you do to stay out? You try to build up the islands. Okay, how do we do this? So we need, first of all, I believe that there should be a focus of international attention. If not, we still have to do it by ourselves, if not. What would be the most credible engineering solutions? The technology. Having designed and formulated what it would be, where would we source the resources in order to be able to implement these solutions? Who would step forward? Will the humans responsible for the human-induced catastrophe be willing to step forward? Should they be obliged to step forward? Is there injustice being committed? here, and if so, how is the remedy to be delivered? I believe that unless we can address this question, then countries like mine are faced with the reality that we have to find somewhere else to go. And so here would be massive displacement of people on a large scale. Okay? Maybe not not on the same scale that's what's been happening, but what it would mean is our entire population would no longer be in the land that they always had. So there would be that displacement. How do we do that? I've been accused of rejecting the notion of climate refugees, and here again I reject it. Okay, so please don't ever use that term again, not in my presence, because we refuse to be climate refugees. And the reason is because we have more than enough time to deal with this. We know it's coming. We will become refugees if we don't do anything about it. And then we, in a rush, we try and get away, and then we would become refugees. But at this point in time, we have more than enough opportunity to deal with it. My recipe has been a little bit controversial, and I know, let me be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. I'm speaking on behalf of the government when I was in office, okay? So I want to make that clear because I don't want to be accused of taking over what the government is doing. But the reality is that we have to relocate. And I advocate a policy of migration with dignity. What do I mean? A lot of people ask me, what do you mean by migration with dignity? All it is simply being more proactive rather than waiting and being victims. We don't want to be victims. I think the fact that we would lose our home, we are already a victim. We don't want to lose our dignity as well as we go somewhere else to find somewhere to live. And so migration with dignity is about providing the preparation for our people, education, upskilling, so that if and when they do migrate, and part of the policy, the idea of migration with dignity is that the people will make their own decision. They would migrate as people who are ready, able and capable to go and live somewhere else as worthwhile citizens, as people who have the qualification, who do not go there to be a burden to the neighbor, to the nation that they go to, who would be able to integrate well into the society they go into, okay? I know, I spoke to some people on a cruise I went on at the end of last year, and they were Germans. And I know Germany has done a tremendous piece of work in terms of welcoming refugees from North Africa. But yet, there is stress, and I know that. And I did ask these people, how are you finding this? Are you not being stressed? And of course they are, and they admit it. And so we don't want a repetition of that. We don't want our people to be subjected to the same kind of pressure, to be looked at sideways and say, what are they doing here? Okay? We want our people to be welcome. We want our people, if and when they do migrate, to actually contribute positively to the society they go into. As I joked, and I do joke quite often, but it is not a joke. It's something that I hope that will come to reality one day. I hope that those of our people who go into new countries will become very senior leading people in parliament. Maybe one of them become a prime minister one day. But that is what I mean. So it's about preparing our people to be able to go and manage the change, the adaptation. So migration would be a part of our adaptation process. The only difference is that our adaptation process is cross-border because we have no high land to go to. Let me tell you a story, okay? So I'll end up with a short story. And this is about, who is going to pay for all of this. But let me tell you a story. It's a story that a friend of mine, it's an analogy of what it is that's happening here. There are these two neighbors, okay? And this neighbor had a tree that's above in his driveway. So he wants to get rid of it. So what he did was chop it down. But what happened, it fell on his neighbor's house, okay? Totally destroyed. And so he goes to his neighbor, oh, what a pity, your house is destroyed. What are you going to do about it? Okay? It's a good question, isn't it? But is it the right question? Okay? Ask yourselves, was that the right question? I know if that happened in the United States, wow, there'd be lawsuits, and somebody else will be paying. Not the one whose house was destroyed, but the one whose tree fell on the. But here we are. We are paying compensation for those that throw their carbon emissions our way. So hopefully that story will remain with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Tong, and maybe we'll hear more stories from you later on. I now pass to Mr. Mansour. And my question to you is, how is FAO Land and Water Division working with stakeholders in dry areas to adapt to changing climate? What are the key promising solutions being promoted to climate change adaptation?
Thank you very much. So I have 7 minutes, right?
Right.
And two enormous challenges. First, to come after President Anote Tong, who set the scene so beautifully and put us on such a challenging situation that I think I have one of the biggest challenges I had ever in my life on speaking in public. And then the second, also linked with his speech, to talk about solutions. So let me make the best use of my time here and try to bring the opinion that I think my organization and the division where we work, my deputy is here, Mr. Unver from the Water Group, and myself, how we see the situation here. When we were invited to participate in this event, linking ICARDA and the Pacific Island Development Forum to different regions, we immediately understood there are lots of commonalities. We were happy to be here discussing with these two apparently different regions, because in this event, in a climate conference, there is a commonality for them. They are very fragile regions, fragile because of the climate change. So these commonalities match both what is happening in these island states as well as in the Near East North Africa region. Now, the second point I would like to refer to you is getting old. We all have stories. I also have one. In my country, I'm Brazilian. In 1992, we hosted the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio plus zero. That time was only Rio. That's the Rio plus 20 came 20 years later. And one of the heads of states, it was Spain, who mentioned something that touched me at that time. I was certainly a young fellow, like many of you here sitting in the audience. And he said it was also a celebration of the 500 years of discovery of Americas. And he said 500 years ago, some of us Europeans came here to find the new horizons of the planet. And now 500 years later, we are here to discover its limits. And we are still challenging to discover the planet's limits when we deal about land use, land transformation, and energy emission, and energy use that cause emissions. And we have to be very respectful when countries that didn't contribute to this change are now paying the bill and suffering when, on the cases that they are suffering now. So it's our responsibility as international organizations on research or on policy and development like FAO to come up with the solutions, to propose solutions, to leverage this. So we have to take on this challenge. And I think Ali did wonderful presenting from the research perspective. You saw the examples he brought. Let me bring you some information from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations that I'm representing here. We deal with, we are an intergovernmental organization, of course, we are an agency. We deal with policies and we deal with practices, putting policies into practice, into the terrain. So we link with research. We're not a research organization. That's why we work so closely with ICARDA and other CGIAR members and other research institutions. And a few weeks ago, we launched the flagship publication named The State of World Food and Nutrition, SOFI. And again, for the first time after many decades, we had bad news. The number of people chronically suffering from hunger in the planet after many years of decreasing, more than a decade of decreasing, is increasing now. And is increasing, it's affecting an estimation of 11% of the population. We are talking about more than 800 million people that are chronically hungry now. The main causes of this increase are twofold: climate change and conflicts. And you know that conflicts are in many cases triggered by climate change. So climate change exacerbates also the issue of conflicts. And one of the points that come very close to the conflicts and climate change is migration, that has been so nicely addressed here. So we cannot dissociate food security, climate change, conflicts, and migration. This comes in the whole package. So we have to look at solutions that are going to be responsive to the people's needs in different situations. My colleagues, I have a short time and I want to be brief on this, pointed out, I'm going to jump the diagnostic. The diagnostic is not good. We are not moving towards anything good in the future. That's why we're sitting here and discussing it. But we think that solutions can be addressed in our areas, for instance, because agriculture links mitigation and adaptation. It's not polarized. For instance, in crop and land use, crop production land use, soil carbon sequestration can play a big role if we promote sustainable soil management. Restoration of degraded lands can help a lot on the mitigation aspects, and also enhancing forest and rangeland. On the adaptation aspects, reversing unsustainable practices like overgrazing or excessive livestock numbers, illegal logging, all the unsustainable practices are contributing to this path of destruction that we have. This has to be reversed, and it has been demonstrated that it's possible, and it's even more profitable to do it this way. And the adaptation using climate-smart agriculture, as has been mentioned here, which I think we are launching tomorrow a new version of the climate-smart agriculture source book here in this COP. In livestock area, there is also big opportunities. I think best practices, if disseminated properly, can reduce 30% of the emissions of livestock, which are one of the major, if not in agriculture sector, the major cause of emissions. And we have to look at the possibilities of bringing this adaptation that has been mentioned here in mitigation under aspects that we are not comfortable addressing yet, but we will have to. I refer to the concept note of this event when they mention about incremental adaptation. We have to promote adaptation, but also the transformational changes. There will be, adaptation is needed, but there are limits for that. So you have to change. You have to change your crop, or you have to change physically. The change will be needed at a certain point. What is also coming back to what President Anotetong mentioned, he mentioned technologies. I would like to expand it to innovation. We have to think on innovation as a way of responding to our current challenges, and not hidden behind the ways that have been done traditionally. This innovation is not only, using drones. That would be cool, but it's not only there. It's doing things different, including in our governance, in our policies, in our way of involving people. So I think I would, it's very comprehensive. My time is up. I would like to invite you to take advantage of being here in Bonn and being here in the climate conference, and help us pass on the debate on how agriculture can be transformational, how agriculture can be incremental in adaptation and mitigation, and what is the role that we can have in promoting a better world for all. Just a bit of propaganda. Tomorrow I will start the Global Climate Action Days. The Agriculture Action Day is just around here in the room 6 at 10 a.m. We are going to look at various topics of interest, including low-carbon livestock, water scarcity management in agriculture, management for improving soil organic carbon, climate-smart agriculture, food loss and waste. As you know, we lose We already produce food for the 9 billion population we will be in 2050. We waste at least 30% of it. In certain crops, we waste 50% of it. So there is a huge role to play also on better management of food systems and on protecting fragile ecosystems like small island states, like the MENA region, dryland ecosystems in general, and mountain ecosystems. So I think this debate is starting, and the solutions have to be proposed with this challenge in mind. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mansour. And you'll receive the bill in the mail for that promo. Now I pass to the young voice on the panel. And what's great about this particular COP is that we're giving space to our young generation who are mostly to lose if we don't change direction in climate change. So Genevieve, we know that the precarious situation we are in is no fault of small islands or young people. What gave the rise to PICAN, the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, and how does it work?
Okay, thank you, Mark. And before I start, I'd like to thank PIDF for this opportunity to be on the panel. It's very hard to be last and follow all the incredible presentations. And especially since it feels like all that was needed to be said has been said, but I will do my best to add to this conversation, and I'll try and be short so that there's lots of time for questions. It's very scary sitting here to hear about the possibility of a 4-degree world, because in a 4-degree world, the Pacific Islands wouldn't exist, and all our homes would be lost, and we'd all be migrating and moving to new places. So yes, quite sombering, but also a challenge, I think, to all of us and to the youth, to the future generations, to continue stepping up and to continue speaking out. PICAN, the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, is a regional alliance of NGOs, CSOs, social movements, grassroots organizations, and not-for-profit organizations from the Pacific Islands region, working on various aspects of climate change, disaster risk and response, and sustainable development. And PICAN is the regional node of Climate Action Network International, the largest civil society climate change network in the world, with over 1,000 members in 120 countries. So PICAN in the Pacific, we work with various organizations every day. We try to, as a network, we try to speak with one voice so that we are not duplicating. We believe that it's important that we work together and we share resources because of the limited capacity in the Pacific. And we try to amplify the voices of our members as much as possible, some of whom you may have heard about. So our members include the Pacific Climate Warriors, incredible activists and young people leading in the various Pacific countries. They include Pacific Islands Represent, which is a fairly new project that is trying to make it so Pacific Islands are able to speak in various forums in climate change with their own voice, and to have those, not to have others speak for them, but to speak up for them. We include the Pacific Conference of Churches, so there's a religious, faith-based voice as well, and we include universities, academia, we include gender in climate change, the diverse voices for equality and action. We have an incredibly diverse group of people who work to ensure that our voices and our stories and our experiences and our culture and our identity are not lost, do not sink beneath the ocean. So with that, I would like to maybe take a few minutes to say what PICAN is hoping to achieve out of this COP. This is the Pacific COP. It's being led by Fiji, a small island developing state, the first time for a small island state to lead the COP. And we're hoping that at this COP there is a recognition that climate change impacts are already being felt by countries that didn't cause them. There is already incredible loss and damage, including Category 5 cyclones and sea level rise and ocean acidification, and lives and livelihoods being affected every day. So for PCAN, we would like to see a commitment to greater ambition and increasing urgency. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to ensure that those who are already experiencing impacts get support for the loss and damage that they are experiencing. We need to ensure that there is a mechanism for Pacific Island countries and other small island developing states to receive this support, and we're hoping that there will be an outcome on loss and damage finance that goes beyond adaptation and mitigation, because we believe that developed countries' fossil fuels is the Pacific's loss and damage, and we cannot continue business as usual if we are to have a world where our generation and future generations will survive and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve, and that is why we have young people in this conference. Thanks. Now I open this up to the floor, so if anyone has a question to address to anyone on the panel, there are microphones on both sides of the room here, if you can use them. We'll start with the lady in front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Özgül Erdemli Mutlu. I'm from Tema Foundation based in Turkey. We are an accredited organization both at UNCCD and UNFCCC. My question will be to Ms. Louise Baker. I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a very, very interesting panel, even though it's late in the day. Thank you very much. I mean, Mr. Tong, your words were so inspirational. I mean, I really appreciate to be present in this panel. Ms. Baker, I want to ask you specifically about how you think about the fact that UNCCD is not really well known at even the UNFCCC. I am carrying my Ordos bag from UNCCD COP13, and I got questions asked by saying whether I was around during COP13 of UNFCCC. It is a little bit disappointing that many people even don't know about the other Rio Convention. My question is particularly regarding this new special report coming out from IPCC, which will finally address the joining interlinkages between land and climate issues. It's going to be out next October. But even before that, how do you see COP23 from the perspective of UNCCD so far? How much are the land issues and food security issues in a way have been covered at COP23? And this will also be addressed to you as well, since you got excellent reports which came out this year. It's about the food security and the linkages between land and climate change. To Mr. Nyong and Ms. Baker, basically, and Genevieve, it's inspirational. I mean, it's really a pleasure to listen to you. You nailed it well. Thank you.
Yes, please, Louise.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're a small convention. We're a small, and the land issues are very, very sensitive. It's the kind of the essence of being a country, isn't it, to manage your own land. So having the international community involved in the state of land is sometimes difficult. I think over the last few years there has been a lot of progress. We're now finally, with the recognition of carbon sinks, that the land sector can contribute to the mitigation agenda. I think we're making progress in terms of the recognition that for vulnerable communities, fragile ecosystems that are most susceptible to climate change, you have to take care of having healthy and productive terrestrial ecosystems. It doesn't work otherwise. I think progress potentially around the slow onset work in the Warsaw mechanism, so slow onset work around droughts, and certainly progress in terms of the agricultural sector being taken seriously. I mean, I think it's how that is now translated. So there has been progress over time. How that's translated really into action, we will wait and see. I think for getting support to countries that don't emit a lot, who will feel the worst damage, and who maybe don't necessarily want to build a wall or have a floating island, then that you must look at the land resource and ensure that the land is healthy and productive to be able to build resilience and to build for the future. There's a long way to go. I think in the future we have to be making sure these synergies aren't just something that the executive secretaries talk about, but they're synergies in terms of implementation on the ground. And I think we all need to do a better job of how we do that going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Mansour, you want to comment?
So yes, just 1 minute. Osgular, we share your frustration, but I think, because I think that there is a discrepancy here, but I think the gap is being filled. It takes time. That's why it's frustrating. But if we look at COP21, COP22, and 23, the situation is better now. It started in Paris. The NDCs, in the Paris Agreement, 90% of the countries mention agriculture and land. So we have the entry point. And that is a game changer. It's not the fault of the convention. We cannot blame the colleagues of the CCC, because CCC never said that, oh, we only discuss climate, everything else out. You remember, CBD also get a very good space here. But I would say CCD, and I say we because I'm at the focal point of CCD, and I was in orders as well. I share the frustration entirely. I think we are gaining terrain. We are looking more people talking about the land sector. The NDC is a good entry point. Adaptation has been understood in a better way. And I'll give you just one example. This year we organized, together with CCD, a symposium in Rome with the IPCC on soil organic carbon. Why soil organic carbon? Because we know that there is twice as much carbon in the soil than in the atmosphere. And you know what? We are not very sure we know how to measure them. So we joined the three, CCD, the SPI, the IPCC, ourselves, WMO, and we look at it, and there were 500 scientists around. It was a very nice outcome. We are preparing an input to the report. Have we resolved the issue of soil organic carbon? No, it's an evolving issue, but we are more comfortable now than we are before. So I think we have to continue in the path. But from COP21 back to COP21 now, I think we are gaining this land sector visibility in the climate dialogue, thanks to people like you, who goes to both.
And all of you are going to be ambassadors for us leaving the room, right?
Thank you. We have a question from the third row here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Arne Lietz. I'm a member of the European Parliament, and even just listening to your voices makes me most vulnerable. It's good to be here, and it's important. I'm trying to work in the European Parliament on a new sector on foreign policy, which is climate diplomacy. We have to be strengthened that topic, and that goes directly into what you have said and mentioned, particularly the last two presentations. Thank you very much. And I think it's a very interesting topic to take the water issue and the land issue together on the panel. So that shows the whole complexity. What I would like to ask Mr. Abu Saba, is it right? If you work already, if you have support by the European Union, and if so, how does that look like? Besides that, I'm wondering, because climate policy, filling up the Paris Agreement, goes hand in hand on my dimension on the SDGs. So I'm an ambassador on the SDGs, because they all have to come together. The question is, how do you use yourself the SDGs? Can you give a best practice? Do you use them in your advocacy work? Do you use them in practice, like really practical things? Because I think we have to learn how we use the SDGs in order to fulfill the important SDG goal on climate, because it goes hand in hand. So thank you for answering. Whoever feels would like to answer that.
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely, we do get support from the European Union, and they support us in two ways. The research programs that ICARDA conducts receives support through the CGIAR group and the CGIAR Council Fund, and also through the bilateral programs. So ICARDA is one of 15 centers that collectively make what we call the consultative group on international agriculture research. And ICARDA itself is the International Center for Agriculture Research in the dry areas. The challenge is that the global flow of funds for the past 10 years has been declining at a time where the challenges have been growing. And the model of the CGIAR collectively is largely based on public funding to produce research outcomes and benefits for the public without any returns. So it's a public good. And at a time when the challenges are increasing, the funding is decreasing. So for me, I think I'm very happy to see interest from parliamentarians within the EU, because this is an important global issue that has to be addressed with the right levels of investment going into those research organizations who are able to come up and study the solutions for the future. So if and when such very gloomy scenarios happen, and we pray God it will never happen, but if it happens, someone has to have the solutions, and that's why ICARDA is investing into those areas. SDGs, absolutely, by all means. The CGIAR collectively, all 15 centers, subscribe collectively to what we call the results framework, which tries to align the collective work of the CGIAR as a whole to the SDGs. And we have a quantitative results measurement framework that tries to capture the collective contribution from each of the centers and report them at the level of the SDGs. ICARDA on its own, our board just approved the strategy last week, which is accompanied by what we call a results framework that attempts to capture all the contributions that we do, whether it's in the area of water, land, crop improvement, or livestock, or genetics, and report those results at the level of the SDGs so that we are able to use them for advocacy and also for resource mobilization. We'll be happy to take, on bilateral basis, any further information or that you may require. Thank you.
Okay. You have a short comment, Louise? Yeah.
I wouldn't mind just adding something to that, actually. So for us, we've gone probably quite specific. So we have taken, or our parties to the convention have taken target 15.3, which is land degradation neutral world, and have adopted that in the strategic plan for the convention to 2030. So now we're kind of fully aligning the work of the convention, at least until 2030, to deliver this SDG target. So yes, completely aligned with the SDG, and it's all about the idea of conservation, sustainable management, and rehabilitation. So that's on that. On the climate diplomacy stuff, interestingly, with the EC funding, we've been supporting an African-led initiative on sustainability, stability, and security. I always get the order wrong, in Africa, which is looking at stabilizing the natural resource base in areas to help minimize forced migration. So as the president said, migration, I'm a migrant. I absolutely moved because the job opportunities were better somewhere else. But it's a choice for me. I can go home. And I think making sure that areas are productive enough with the right kind of infrastructure, with the right kind of opportunities, has to be a part of our kind of strategy around migration, our strategy around managed migration. And so this initiative is really an African response to the discussion around migration and embedding that in the idea of productive natural resources in the face of drought, climate change.
Thank you. Mr. Martel?
Yeah, in relation to the SDGs, our organization is very young. It's barely 2 years old. In fact, we were born on the 4th of September 2015, just a few weeks before the adoption of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. So you can say that it's part of our DNA. And therefore, but we are still in the process of having our first strategic plan to be adopted. But it's actually it's a strategic plan. The long-term one will be based all the way to 2030, and it's essentially built on the SDGs. In referring to the Rio and Rio plus 20, the organization actually came from the conclusions and the recommendations of Rio plus 20. So the first discussions about setting up this new multilateral agency for the region in the Pacific, and we do have several other organizations, multilateral organizations, that are working on environment and sustainable development. Ours is a multi-stakeholder one. This is a very unique setup where we even had to actually create flags for the leaders of the civil society to be able to sit around the same table as the Pacific leaders. And the creation of this organization came out of the leaders' decisions. And I'm pleased to say that President Anote Tong was one of the first presidents of the Pacific to sign the charter of the organization, realizing that you cannot achieve the SDGs only with support, only by governments. It has to be done as an activity that has to be embraced by both civil society and the private sector in each of these countries. So I just wanted to raise this. So hopefully our next strategy will be, our first strategy will be adopted by February 2018, and we'll be able to share that with the European Union, who's currently not funding the Pacific Islands Development Forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mansour?
Yes, quick one. Thank you very much for bringing up the question of the SDGs. So we are Food and Agriculture Organization, so the SDG in our heart is SDG 2, the one on zero hunger and nutrition, food and nutrition for all. But for you to have an idea, out of the 17 SDGs, there are about 100 plus, as you know, 100 plus targets. We in FAO are the custodians of more than 20 of them in different SDGs. And it's so important that we work on the liaison, on the link, on the weaving of one and the other, not taking them as silos or isolation. So much so that our 4 technical departments are obviously agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and 1 department on climate at same level in the technical areas, because our Director General is very keen to bring climate as a cross-cutting issue in any technical area we do. And now your question will raise my bill here because of the propaganda. My Director General asked one day he could come to this COP to make the case, and we selected a high-level event that will be held on 14 November on SDG 2 and climate. And he's coming to speak on that one only. That is the moment that we are going to have the highest level of FAO addressing how SDG 2 links with SDG 13 and all the others that we can contribute to the climate issue.
Thank you very much. One last question. I think we just have time for one last question, which is here.
Hi, my name is Homero Paltan. I'm a delegate from the University of Oxford. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentations. They were truly inspirational. I'm aware, I understood that you've been involved in really, really good decisions, in really good ideas and strategies. So my question is, what do you think is the best way to take a good decision to implement a good idea given the range of uncertainties that we have with all the possible alternatives or strategies that we have? Thank you.
Is that directed to anyone in particular?
No, to in general to.
Who wants to?
That's always my question, you know. You know, I know the people that I work with. I continue to ask myself that question as I see a mess of people moving back and forth. What are we doing here? What will we be able to come away with? And I deal more at the basic level because I've had to deal with people. I've had to answer in Parliament. And so these are the kind of questions that people are asking, and they're demanding answers for. And so people in my country don't care about 1.5 degrees, 350 parts per million. They don't understand these things. But what they understand is, do you think you have a solution for the problem that you say is going to happen? And I think we need to focus more, okay? I think, let me go back to the comments that I made. How do we go back with practical outcomes? And I think we need to identify maybe ask the right questions. Because sometimes I understand that here we are almost 200 countries coming from different angles, different agendas. I know there's no question in my mind that of the almost 200 countries, there are those that come here because they have problems. There are those that come here looking for opportunities. And there are those that come here looking to find a way out of what, I suspect, okay? Because climate change, as I've had the experience of talking with other leaders, and they talk to me, we're in a press conference, and there's these two guys, and they say, no, 2 degrees is our limit. We cannot go below 2 degrees, because to go below 2 degrees would damage our economies. And I'm sitting next to them, and I'm looking at them. And so I put up, and there's a whole mess of media people like you, as MENA. Can I respond to these two? I said, I understand what these two are talking about. They're talking about their economies. But if they're talking about 2 degrees, even 1.5, we would lose our home, and it's about the future of our people. So there you are. How can you make the comparison? But this is the problem that we are facing. We all come from different angles. But I think what we need in order to be able to address this is not to come here taking our national agendas. We've got to come here understanding what it is we're trying to solve. And this is a global issue. Climate change, there is no room for prime ministers and presidents to be here bringing their own national agenda. They've got to come here to address a global problem, not to safeguard their economies, not to safeguard their national interest. If we come here with that in mind, then we're not going to go anywhere. And so that is the first obstacle that we will face. The other obstacle we always find is whenever there is a change of government, there is a change of policy on climate change. We know that. I mean, I see this in the region that I come from. It's all over the papers every day. We hear what's happening in the United States. And at the same time, we see some changes which are very positive. In Canada, I met the new Prime Minister from Canada. I met him in the Chogram meeting. I said, Canada can do it. Why can not the rest of you do it? Because Canada did a 180-degree change in policy. So really the question, are we ever going to solve this problem as long as we continue to bring our national agendas? Because my contention is politicians think in 4-year spans, or whenever the next election is going to be. What we need are global leaders. And until we can get that, we need global leadership on an issue which has global proportions. And the debate I've had with my colleagues, I have no problem. You can go for your 2 degrees, but keep your emissions in your national borders, and I really have no problems. But you cannot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we're coming to the end. So I thank profusely the panelists for a very, very interesting session this evening. And also the audience. You've been very, very amazing audience today. So thank you very much, and travel safely back home. Thank you.